I love different styles of music. I love all kinds of interesting things and musics that don't necessarily go together.
One was a church-trained piano prodigy with a love for melody. The other was a wild genius who turned music into mayhem. When George Duke first met Frank Zappa at a club in 1969, he assumed it was just another gig. But stepping into Zappa's world was like walking into a storm. What followed wasn't just music, it was control, chaos, and something even longtime fans had no idea about. Years later, as Duke faced his final days, he shared a haunting confession that would forever reshape how the world remembers Frank Zappa. George Duke's rise to fame. Frank Zappa changed George Duke's life in ways most fans would never expect, and the influence Zappa had on him impacted various aspects of his life. But George Duke's fascination with sound started way before he met Zappa at just 4 years old. In what was meant to be an ordinary trip to see a jazz legend, Duke Ellington, George's life was transformed and his love for music was born. Sitting in that audience, hearing the music swell and watching Ellington command the stage, something clicked inside him. Speaking about the experience in an interview, Duke said, "I don't remember it too well, but my mother told me I went crazy. I ran around saying, 'Get me a piano, get me a piano.'" Unlike most childhood fixations, this wasn't a passing phase. His mother took his request seriously and bought him a small upright piano. From that moment on, George Duke began listening, absorbing, and figuring out how to shape notes into stories. The streets of Marin City, where he grew up, were far from glamorous, and the odds of a young black kid breaking into the elite world of music weren't high. But Duke was determined. He began looking for a sound that was raw and emotional. Thankfully, he found it in the church, and gospel became his first true training ground. Playing in a small Baptist church near his home, Duke learned more than just chords. He learned emotion. This grounding in gospel music gave him a sense of rhythm and soul that would later set him apart from many of his peers in the jazz world. But George Duke was never interested in staying inside one lane. While he continued to play gospel at church, he started studying classical piano, a discipline that required precision, structure, and patience. Even as a teenager, he was bridging musical worlds that didn't often meet. He could move from Bach to blues, from Sunday service to Chopin, and it never felt like a contradiction. It was natural. George pursued music seriously, academically, and professionally. First came his undergraduate studies at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in trombone and composition. Even though he was already deeply connected to the piano, studying the trombone gave him a broader understanding of arrangement and orchestration, tools that would later become crucial in his work as a band leader and producer. He didn't stop there. He went on to get a master's degree in composition from San Francisco State University, where he began crafting his own ideas about how jazz, funk, soul, and even rock could intersect without losing their individual integrity. His first real breakthrough came when he formed the George Duke Trio, a group that would eventually put him on the map in the jazz fusion scene. Audiences immediately responded to his unique sound, and the industry began to notice them. One of the trio's most defining moments came when French jazz violinist Jean-Luc Ponty took notice of Duke's talent and invited him to collaborate. Their partnership led to a series of performances in Europe and an appearance at the Newport Jazz Festival, which was one of the most respected platforms for jazz musicians at the time. For Duke, this was more than exposure. It was validation. It proved that his ideas, the ones that blurred lines and ignored rigid genre expectations, could not only work but also thrive. The George Duke Trio wasn't just playing sets, they were pushing boundaries. And those early years set the stage for what would become a career defined by exploration. But even as Duke was beginning to carve out a path of his own, something unexpected was about to happen, and it would both challenge and change the course of his music. It wasn't another tour or academic opportunity. It was a meeting with a musician whose world looked entirely different from Duke's, both musically and personally. That musician was Frank Zappa. And when their paths finally crossed, it wasn't just a collaboration. It was a collision of styles, personalities, and philosophies about what music could and should be. But what started as a professional opportunity would soon become something far more complicated. Meeting Frank Zappa. By 1969, George Duke was already gaining recognition as a serious musician. He had toured internationally, performed at Newport, and built a reputation for blending genres with precision and soul. But nothing in his life could have prepared him for what came next. Because in that same year, while playing a gig at a small but influential club in Los Angeles called The Experience, someone in the audience was watching closely. And that someone was Frank Zappa. Zappa wasn't just any audience member. He was already an icon of musical rebellion, known for his unpredictable compositions, biting satire, and deep skepticism of mainstream culture. To most musicians, a visit from Frank Zappa meant curiosity, interest, or maybe even trouble. But when Zappa saw George Duke on stage working his electric piano with both elegance and risk, something sparked. Duke wasn't just playing music, he was stretching it. Moving effortlessly from jazz runs to funk grooves to classical phrasing, he seemed like someone who didn't fear boundaries. And that was exactly the kind of musician Zappa was always looking for. After the show, Zappa approached Duke. The offer was simple: join the Mothers of Invention. But for Duke, it wasn't so simple at all. Despite his outward confidence, George Duke had serious doubts. He knew who Zappa was, or at least he thought he did. Zappa had a reputation for making music that sounded chaotic, almost intentionally dissonant. For a classically trained musician who valued structure, beauty, and harmony, Zappa's world felt like anarchy. It was clever and bold, but it didn't make sense to Duke, at least not at first. His instincts told him to stay in familiar territory. After all, he had just started gaining ground in the jazz world. Jumping into Zappa's orbit felt risky and even reckless. Still, something about the offer lingered. Zappa wasn't offering a sideman position. He wanted Duke to be part of something creative that didn't fit into traditional boxes. So Duke agreed to come to a rehearsal, and that rehearsal would change everything. When Duke walked into Zappa's studio, it didn't feel like any space he'd rehearsed in before. That first rehearsal wasn't easy. For Duke, it was reportedly disorienting. He'd spent years mastering theory and perfecting his touch at the piano, but none of that seemed to matter in Zappa's world unless it served the moment. Because Zappa wasn't interested in beauty for beauty's sake. He wanted tension, surprise, and musicians who could keep up, not just technically, but emotionally and mentally. In the end, Duke didn't walk away. He signed on. Joining the Mothers of Invention would become one of the most defining periods of George Duke's career, and also one of the most complex. With Zappa, Duke wasn't just playing music. He was being pushed to his limit, again and again. Every night, the band moved between genres like it was second nature, from jazz to rock to funk to avant-garde noise, all within a single performance. Duke had to play fast, play smart, and sometimes play through material that felt deliberately strange. But something about it opened him up. Duke's first major project with Zappa was Chunga's Revenge, where he contributed keys and helped shape the album's shifting, jagged textures. That was just the beginning. Over the next several years, he would appear on a series of landmark albums, including 200 Motels, a part satirical, part surreal rock opera that blurred the line between concept and chaos. There was also Overnight Sensation, one of Zappa's most commercially successful records, where Duke's playing added a layer of funk-driven sophistication beneath Zappa's famously sarcastic lyrics. By the time they got to Apostrophe and Roxy and Elsewhere, Duke was no longer just a guest musician. He was part of the inner circle, trusted to navigate the most difficult arrangements and still bring something of his own to the table. His influence became even more pronounced on One Size Fits All, where the musical structures were dense and demanding, but Duke still found room to stretch out, adding groove and warmth to music that often veered into the absurd. One of their final collaborations during that era was Bongo Fury, a strange hybrid live studio album that featured Captain Beefheart alongside Zappa's band. It was exactly the kind of project that Duke, just a few years earlier, might have walked away from. But now, I knew how to thrive in it. Zappa's music demanded total surrender, and for a while Duke gave him that. But surrender always comes at a cost. And behind the creative energy, something else was beginning to stir. A tension that would grow as Duke began asking deeper questions about where this musical journey was really heading. Because while the stage lights were bright and the music was boundary-breaking, not everything in the Mothers of Invention felt like freedom. creative chaos, and controversy. Working with Frank Zappa was never just about music. For those who joined his orbit, it was an experience shaped equally by brilliance and contradiction, a space where creative freedom collided with tight control. George Duke entered the mothers of invention hoping to grow, and he did. But as the years went on, he also found himself caught inside a system where the lines between liberation and limitation were constantly shifting. Zappa's public image was that of a fearless innovator, someone unafraid to question authority, to mock convention, and to stretch music until it no longer resembled anything familiar. But behind the curtain, many saw a different man who was deeply intelligent but also demanding, emotionally distant, and obsessively controlling. For all the experimentation Zappa allowed in his band's sound, he maintained strict control over nearly every other aspect, from setlist to solos, from credits to contracts. People who worked closely with Zappa often spoke of his intensity. He had a razor-sharp mind and expected those around him to keep up. Mistakes weren't tolerated for long, and loyalty didn't always guarantee longevity. Some former members of the Mothers of Invention, including those who had been there from the early days, would later end up in legal battles with Zappa, fighting over unpaid royalties, disputed writing credits, and years of tension that had quietly built beneath the surface. These weren't minor squabbles. In the mid to late 70s, several musicians who had once stood beside Zappa on stage now found themselves locked in lawsuits with him. They felt undervalued, overworked, and at times deliberately cut out of recognition for their contributions. For someone like George Duke, who came from a background where collaboration was built on mutual respect and shared ownership, this side of Zappa was difficult to reconcile. Some critics even described Zappa as a narcissist. He was brilliant, but he could also be detached, distant, and coldly pragmatic. To some, this meant he saw music as the only thing that mattered, often at the expense of personal connection. For George Duke, who valued both artistry and humanity, this created an internal conflict. On one hand, Zappa gave him access to complex, challenging material that allowed him to grow. On the other, the structure around that freedom sometimes felt more like a cage than a canvas. In fact, Zappa ran his band like a military operation. He reportedly banned recreational substances entirely, not out of morality, but because he expected total professionalism. Missed rehearsals or sloppy performances were unacceptable. For Zappa, discipline mattered more than rebellion. He didn't care what was cool, only what kept the music razor-sharp and on time. Duke would later describe the experience of being in Zappa's band as one of unlearning. He had to strip down everything he thought he knew about music, performance, and even identity just to function in the group. There were no guarantees. One night he might be playing extended solos in front of sold-out crowds. The next, he might be asked to play absurd lines or act out bizarre scenes for Zappa's theatrical pieces. The shift was constant and the pressure never let up. But while Zappa expected his musicians to bend to his vision, he himself was dealing with deep physical and emotional stress. In 1971, during a performance at the Rainbow Theatre in London, a fan rushed the stage and pushed Zappa into the orchestra pit. The fall was brutal. He suffered multiple fractures, including a crushed larynx, serious head trauma, and long-term damage to his back and legs. For months, he was confined to a wheelchair. His voice was permanently altered. The incident not only reshaped Zappa's physical life, forcing him to deal with chronic pain for the rest of his career, but also seemed to harden him emotionally. The sense of detachment that people had already noticed now seemed more pronounced. He became more guarded, more isolated, and more obsessive about controlling the space around him. Yet, even in pain, Zappa never slowed down. In fact, some would say the accident pushed him even further into his work. He recorded prolifically, toured relentlessly, and experimented with technology long before it became mainstream in music. When the synclavier, a complex digital synthesizer and music workstation, became available in the late 80s, Zappa threw himself into it. He could compose entire orchestral scores on his own without having to deal with human variables like mood, interpretation, or error. For someone who had grown increasingly wary of collaboration, it was the perfect tool. Unfortunately, in 1990, Zappa was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The diagnosis came late, and the disease was already advanced. But instead of retreating, he doubled down. He spent the last years of his life composing obsessively on the synclavier, working in near isolation. Friends and collaborators said he was both driven and defiant, unwilling to let illness define his final years. He released new material, worked on classical compositions, and remained as provocative as ever in his public statements. Zappa passed away on December 4, 1993, at the age of 52. The music world lost one of its most complex voices, a man who had refused to fit any mold, who had mocked fame even as he became famous, and who had inspired and alienated countless musicians along the way. But the story didn't end there. After Zappa's death, his estate quickly became the center of a family battle. His widow, Gail Zappa, took control of the business side of his legacy, running the Zappa family trust with a firm grip. But tensions between their children soon exploded into public view. Dweezil, who had followed in his father's musical footsteps, clashed with his siblings, particularly Amit and Diva, over rights to the Zappa name, touring performances, and access to archives. The disputes weren't small. They involved cease and desist letters, financial disagreements, and sharp public statements. Fans who had loved Zappa's independent spirit were now watching that same spirit fractured within his own family. What was meant to be a legacy of fearless creativity had become entangled in legal disputes and personal bitterness. For George Duke, watching all of this unfold from a distance must have brought mixed emotions. He had lived inside the Zappa machine, experienced its genius and its strain. He had felt the pressure, the pull, and the confusion of working with a man who could inspire and isolate in the same breath. And although their time together had changed him forever, there had also come a moment when Duke knew that it was time to step away, because even brilliance has limits. And for all that Zappa had taught him, George Duke eventually realized he needed something Zappa couldn't give: space. Why George Duke left Zappa? George Duke's time with Frank Zappa was never meant to last forever. As much as he respected the genius and complexity of Zappa's vision, he always knew that part of him was pulled in another direction, toward groove, soul, and a sound that felt rooted more in emotion than abstraction. His first departure from the mothers of invention came in 1970, and it wasn't a sudden decision. It was a shift that had been slowly building. By that time, Duke had been with Zappa for about 2 years. He had survived the shock of Zappa's rehearsal rooms, adapted to the dissonant arrangements, and grown as a musician in ways few other environments could have offered. But he had also started to feel something missing. Zappa's music was dense, cerebral, and often ironic. It could be dazzling. But for Duke, who had grown up on gospel and was now drawn deeper into the worlds of funk and soul, it had begun to feel cold. The opportunity to join Cannonball Adderley's band came at the right moment. Adderley, a legendary alto saxophonist and a central figure in hard bop and soul jazz, represented a return to music that was warmer and more grounded. With Cannonball, Duke didn't have to twist himself into experimental frameworks anymore. He could sit in the pocket, let the groove breathe, and most importantly, reconnect with the emotional core of why he'd started playing music in the first place. Leaving Zappa wasn't about rejecting complexity. It was about reconnecting with something more natural to his instincts. And so in 1971, he stepped away. With Adderley, he found a more organic space to play and grow. The music was still rich and sophisticated, but it was easier. Duke eventually opened up about Frank Zappa's reaction to his exit from the band in an interview, saying, "Frank didn't like it, but he understood. Cannon was a jazz hero of mine." This new period of Duke's life, playing keys alongside Cannonball, gave him a new sense of purpose. He didn't abandon what he learned from Zappa, but he started to refine what he wanted for himself. But then, in 1973, something unexpected happened. George Duke returned to Frank Zappa's band. This was a reunion that shocked fans and industry insiders. This time, he came back with Jean-Luc Ponty, the same violinist he'd once collaborated with during his early jazz trio years. Zappa was assembling another formidable lineup of musicians, and Duke, now more confident in his voice, felt ready to jump back in. The second stint with Zappa was just as demanding, but Duke had changed. He wasn't as rattled by the pressure. He knew the terrain, and he was no longer trying to conform. He brought more of himself into the mix, including his funk sensibilities, his melodic intuition, and his deep understanding of groove, and for a while it worked. They made some of their most iconic recordings during this time. Duke's keyboard work on those records added a kind of richness and pulse that helped Zappa's avant-garde ideas stay connected to something rhythmic. It was a fusion that pushed both artists in new directions. However, once again, it didn't last for long. By 1975, Duke decided it was time to leave again, and this time, he didn't come back. But contrary to what many fans believe, he wasn't angry. In fact, there wasn't a dramatic falling out, but the signs had become clear. Zappa's world, though full of opportunity, was also consuming. It demanded full commitment, often at the cost of creative independence. The irony was that Zappa encouraged innovation, yet his system left very little room for others to lead. For someone like George Duke, who was beginning to hear his own sound more clearly, that setup became limiting. He wanted something else that was truer to his identity. Zappa's music had stretched him, but once again, Duke wanted to return to something that felt less like a math equation and more like a conversation. From that point forward, George Duke's career flourished in new ways. He recorded albums that blended jazz, funk, rhythm and blues, and fusion on his own terms. He collaborated with artists across genres, from Stanley Clarke to Diane Reeves, and built a name that stood independently, not just as the guy from Zappa's band, but as a visionary in his own right. Still, Duke never erased those years with Zappa from his history, and years later, as he reflected on everything he had lived and learned, George Duke began to share more about what those years had really meant, especially what they gave him and what they took from him. The Final Days and Confession. As George Duke entered the final chapter of his life, the energy that had once carried him from gospel churches to Zappa's stage and into the world of jazz-funk stardom began to slow. Decades of performance, production, and experimentation had taken their toll, but nothing could have prepared him for the grief that arrived in 2011, when his wife, Corinne, passed away after a long illness. They had been married for over 40 years, and through all the highs and lows of his career, Corinne had been Duke's quiet constant. Her death left him completely gutted, and no tour, studio session, or standing ovation could fill the silence she left behind. In a rare moment of raw openness, Duke admitted that he didn't want to play music anymore because he was broken. That kind of loss didn't just affect his spirit, it reached into his music, which had always been rooted in joy, rhythm, and celebration. Now, everything sounded different, and the melodies felt heavier. For a while, Duke considered walking away entirely. He'd given the world so much. Maybe it was time to stop. But in the midst of that pain, something inside him stirred again, not in defiance of grief, but in conversation with it. He returned to the studio not to revive his career, but to process everything he couldn't say out loud. The result was his final album, Dreamweaver, released in 2013, a deeply spiritual, emotionally transparent body of work that many fans and critics would later call his most personal. This was not an album made for charts or radio play. Dreamweaver sounded like a man in conversation with his own soul. It was the most honest music he ever made, and woven into that honesty was a quiet reckoning with everything he had lived through, especially the years spent with Frank Zappa. In an interview, George Duke opened up about what Zappa had meant to him. He said, "I learned so much with Frank. When I joined the band, I was a musical elitist. I was a jazz player, and that's all I wanted to know. The guy was so intelligent that I figured out I needed to be there to learn something. He got me to play synthesizers. He would tell me, 'Music is a white canvas. You can paint any picture on it you want.'" Coming from Duke, that was no small admission. He had studied with master composers, performed with jazz giants, and led his own bands across multiple decades. But it was Zappa, the eccentric, abrasive, relentless composer, who had planted the seed of creative courage in him. That courage had allowed Duke to blend genres with confidence, to experiment without apology, and to keep evolving long after others had settled. In a 2012 interview just a year before his passing, Duke opened up about why he went back to Zappa's band after initially leaving. He said, "One of the reasons I decided to go back with Frank was because the music he was suggesting that we play, or wanted to play, was really interesting. I mean, besides being quirky like it always was and all that, it had another thing going on that really required musicians that could play." In his final years, as Duke looked back at everything he'd built, he could see clearly what Zappa had given him. Not just the challenges, but the tools. Without Zappa, Duke might never have become the kind of fearless, genre-blurring, heart-forward artist he eventually became. The pressure had been real and sometimes suffocating, but it had also been formative. He didn't live long after Dreamweaver. George Duke passed away on August 5, 2013, at the age of 67, after a battle with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. The music world mourned the loss of a man whose influence extended far beyond jazz and funk, a man who had played with numerous iconic stars, but who never let fame define his craft. In his last years, Duke became a quiet symbol of what it means to survive creative pressure and personal tragedy and still return to music. And among the final truths he shared, one stood out for its vulnerability. He hadn't always understood Zappa's purpose in his life, but he had come to recognize it. And in the end, George Duke didn't just walk away from Zappa. He carried him into the quiet spaces of his personal life, where no words were needed to explain what had once been so hard to say. Between Duke and Zappa, who was your favorite? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.